welcome to today's lunchtime lesson. I'm really excited about today's lunchtime lesson because we're going to talk about something I'm really passionate about when it comes to teaching English, and that is pragmatics, okay? And we're going to look at pragmatics in the format or in the examples of using these structures with the word would, because it's a really great example. So when you think of the word would, very often we'll associate it with conditional structures. And for example, second and third conditional structures. But we use would in lots and lots of different ways, and even within those different structures with different meanings, okay, and different functions. And that is what this word pragmatics means, yeah? So pragmatics is it's a linguistic term. And what pragmatics is looking at how we use language. So, you know, what function does language express for us? What can we do with different kinds of language? For example, when I use would in this example, if I won the lottery, I'd buy a car. The pragmatics of that, the function of that, the reason I'm using it is to express a hypothetical situation and consequence now or in the future. Now, we give these common structures like grammar names, and in this case, the second conditional, yeah? But it's much more important that we consider the pragmatics rather than sort of the grammary aspect of it or the names of it. So if you learn English using pragmatics instead of these kind of standardized grammar rules, it's the very best way that you will use English naturally and fluently. And when it comes to English, it's the grammar that we have in English is much easier to construct than a lot of other languages. For example, take Spanish or French or Greek. So those languages, the grammar is much more complicated. But even though the grammar is more complicated in those languages, in terms of constructing it, sometimes English can be a bit more difficult because of the fact that we mix and recycle lots of different structures, okay? So just have a little think, guys, about how many tenses we have in the English language, okay? Got number 6 from Diana. Oh, Manushka says that she thinks it's 11 and Monica says it's 12. Okay. Technically, guys, there's only 2 tenses in the English language, right? So this is what you call a morphological tense, right? So for a tense to technically be a tense, a word has to be able to change independently without any auxiliary verb helping it do that. So we really only have the past simple in English where we add ed onto the word, or we change the form of the word with our irregular verbs, or we have the present simple when we add that s to the third person, yeah? Everything else in English requires an auxiliary for it to have a future meaning or a present meaning or a past meaning, yeah? And that's where pragmatics comes into it, okay? So what happens very often when we learn English is we try and learn English using the grammar rules of our language, okay? And that can be problematic because they will not always apply the same way. We don't really have those grammar rules within English. So that's why it's very easy to get to an intermediate level of English quite quickly because it's not difficult to construct the grammar, but it becomes much harder to take that leap into a more advanced level of English because we have to think outside the box. We have to think differently from using these kind of standardized grammar rules, okay? And if we don't think outside that box, we have a lot of problems when we see structures repeated in different contexts that we expect to be one of these grammar rules. That's what we're going to investigate a little bit today through these different structures of would. So here's a very commonly used structure of would. I'd like to visit France. Yeah, really, really commonly used. What I'd like you to think about, you can just think about it to yourself, take a minute. I want you to think about what the function, what the pragmatics is of this, right? So why am I using it? What am I expressing and doing with it? In what kind of situation you might use it in. So what places, what social contexts would I use it if I'm speaking or if I'm writing? And I'd like you to think if there's anything important, you need to think about how we construct it and its structure. Do I need to use some infinitives in there? Do I need to use gerunds? That kind of stuff, okay? So just take a little minute to yourselves and consider how we use this structure here. Okay, so let's have a look. So we use the structure of would like or would like to express preference, right? And we very often use it, especially when we're ordering things or making requests. Yeah. So what I mean by that is very often you'd use it in a restaurant, so if you're ordering food or drink, or we'd use it in a shop if we're asking for something like I'd like a coffee or I'd like to return this, please. And what this structure does as well, the other aspect, pragmatic aspect to it, is that it allows us to be more polite, right? We can make more polite requests. So if you compare those two previous examples I gave you to this, I want a coffee, or I want to return this, please. In English, that's too direct for us, okay? When you're making requests, we like it to be softer and more polite. And this is what this structure allows us to do. When it's in a question form, we also use it to make offers. For example, would you like a coffee? And we can also use it to talk about things that we would personally like to do in the future. Yeah, like I'd like to visit London someday. There's a slightly different structure, difference in the structure if we're using a verb or if we're using a noun. For example, when we've got a verb, we need to use to with an infinitive, like I'd like to go home. And if we're just following it by a noun, I don't need to worry about that. So it'd just be, I'd like some tea. Okay. You'll also see it quite often used, guys, with would like to have plus a participle, like this. Yeah. For example, I'd like to have watched the football, but I had to go out. And when we're using it in this structure, then we're talking about things that happened in the past that we missed out on. Okay. So if you think about the pragmatics of that, we're kind of expressing regret with this structure, right? So if I say I like to have watched the football, but I had to go out, I wanted to do it, but I didn't. Yeah, so I have a bit of regret about that. So you can see from what is a quite a simple structure and what is very often considered a basic one because it's taught at the big in beginner books. There are so many different functions and so much to consider about the pragmatics of it. And it's so flexible. We can use it in so many different ways, yeah? We also have other structures that include would that we can use for preference, like I'd rather go to the cinema or I'd prefer to stay at home. Both of those mean the same thing. Just watch out and remember that they're structured slightly differently. So we have would rather plus an infinitive, and would prefer is with to plus infinitive. Little top tip, guys, if you're doing Cambridge exams, especially the first certificate or the Cambridge Advanced, that's a really commonly tested item in keyword transformations. Okay, now here's the next one for you guys. Would you mind helping me? So we're going to do the same. Have a look at that example. Consider what the function is, where we might use it, and anything you need to think about how you're constructing it. So we're using this when we want to ask for something politely, okay? If you work in any kind of English-speaking environment, like an office or a shop or a cafe or anything that involves a team especially, this is something that you will hear a lot, yeah? And it means the same as can you, but again, we're using that would for softening and making something more polite, okay? It's less direct, yeah? As a general rule in English, if we are being less direct, we are being more polite, okay? So it's a really useful term for if you're working in English in groups of people. In terms of the structure, guys, we need to follow this with a verb in the gerund, okay? So would you mind helping me? Would you mind buying this? Would you mind calling her? And the reason for that, if you remember, is because we have to follow this with a noun. We need to ask for something, okay? So remember, as a general rule, when a verb functions as a noun, we're going to use ing. Okay, if you want some more information on that, check out our previous video on gerunds and infinitives. I go into that in a lot more detail. Right, next structure for you. When I was little, my mum would always pick me up from school. Oops, sorry, typo. From, not from school. Okay, so again, let's look at this example. Think about what the function is, where you might use it, anything you need to consider about its structure. We're really using would here to talk about repeated actions that happened in the past. So that means basically if we're expressing past habits, yeah? It's something we would use a lot if you're telling a story or if you're telling an anecdote about what life used to be like for you or what would happen in the past, okay? When we're talking about our memories. It's really similar to how we use the structure used to. And normally you could interchange both of those structures with would or used to, and the meaning won't really make any difference. So I could say I'd cook for my friends every weekend, or I could say I used to cook for my friends every weekend. They're very similar. Used to has that emphasis that you don't do it anymore. Would has this idea of a repeated past habit, okay? But they are quite interchangeable. If we're talking, however, about states, yeah, when we use these kind of state verbs like feel or be or agree, believe, need, know, all of those ones, then I don't use would, okay? So I could say he used to be a cook, but not he would be a cook, okay? And I could say I used to believe that my father was a spy, but I would believe that my father was a spy. No, in those examples, I can't use it. And when we're talking about history, we use this structure a lot, actually, but we bring in an extra word into it, and it would look like this. The servants would have used this object to clean the stairs, okay? So here, we're using that auxiliary of have with the participle, okay? And to show that we're talking about an earlier past, it brings us further into the past. It's something that we also do when, for example, with modal verbs of speculation. If we want to put those into the past, we do exactly the same thing. Like if I say he must have been the murderer, we know that I'm talking about the past. So we're applying the same kind of rule here. And if you go, for example, to a historical house for a tour, that's a great example of where you'd hear this language. Normally in the summer, now starting the summer, we'd be welcoming lots of international students onto our cultural courses, and we'd be taking them to the Georgian House, which is one of our favorite places to visit. And that's a great place because you hear the guides using that structure all of the time, yeah? So this is a great example of where you would hear that. Okay, next structure, his mother wouldn't let him go to the party, okay? So again, look at the example, think about what the function is, where we might use it, and anything we need to consider about its structure. So here we're using this to talk about willingness, right? So how happy you are for something, to let something happen, okay? So if you're willing for something to happen, you're happy to let it happen. We quite often use this in the present with will as well to express this idea of willingness. Yeah, like if I say I'll help you, it means I'm offering to help you and I'm happy to help you. And in the past, we could apply it equally, but with would, okay? So if we compare these two sentences, guys, his mother wouldn't let him go to the party, like we just saw. Here, I'm saying that she was not happy for that to happen. Yeah, she said that he couldn't go. Compare that with that previous use of would we just looked at. His mother would let him go to parties, and there we're talking about a repeated habit, okay? And a lot of the reason that we have this difference is because of that negation that's happening here, yeah? We generally use this structure in the negative rather than in the positive, okay? When you're saying how happy you are for something to happen or not happen. But they're quite different, even though they look very similar, they have very different functions, okay? The pragmatics of those sentences are really different. So I mentioned at the beginning that we, of course, use would with the second and third conditionals. I'm not going to go into conditionals, guys. We just did a really big series on conditionals, so you can go back and watch all of those videos if you weren't sure about it. But I do want to just highlight this structure, which is very often taught at the same time as conditionals, yeah? I wish that you wouldn't smoke so much. Okay, so you know what to do. Look at the example, think about what the function is, where you might use it, and anything you need to consider about its structure. So if I say, I wish that you or he or she or John or Mary or whoever it is would plus an infinitive verb, when I'm using this structure, I generally use it to talk about people who are doing or not doing something that I don't like and that I would like to be different, that I want to have that changed, yeah? So when we're talking about ourselves, we don't really use it because, you know, we have the power to change that. So I wouldn't say, I wish that I would stop working so much. I would say, I wish I didn't work so much. And we don't use it when it's sort of something nobody can change, like, I wish that the earth would stop moving around the sun. Okay, we don't have that in our power. But bizarrely, we do use it to talk about the weather, even though we can't change the weather. So we would say, I wish that it would stop raining, for example, okay? But it's much more generally used to sort of talk about someone else's annoying habit, things that you don't want them to do, or that you would like to see differently, right? Like, I wish my sister would stop borrowing my clothes without asking, yeah? Okay. We don't use it when there isn't this feeling that we want somebody to change, okay? So I wouldn't say, I wish that Christmas would be tomorrow, because I don't want that to change. It's just something I want, yeah? I would say, I wish that Christmas was tomorrow. And like I said before, I wouldn't use it to talk about myself. So I wouldn't say, I wish that I would be more patient. I would just say, I wish I was more patient. Because it's a bit strange to use this to talk about myself when I have the power to change it. Okay, I can change my behavior. Looked at lots and lots and lots of different functions with would. We've seen functions for making requests politely, for making offers, talking about past habit, expressing willingness, expressing things that you'd like to change, yeah? And we've seen how differently we can use this structure, this one little word. But do remember as well that pronunciation with would is important, okay? So in a number of the examples we've seen today, you still need to contract would, okay? Remember that when we are writing a contraction, we only apply it to pronouns. So it would look like this. I would never write that, yeah? Because it looks horrible, right? So I would never say, I would never write Claire would like a coffee. But do remember that when we're speaking, we make those contractions on everything, not just our pronouns. So I would say, Claire would like a coffee, okay? Claire would like a coffee, making that block of sound. Remember too, that when we have would and you, if it's a question, when we have the two words together, we get these great examples of connected speech when two sounds come together and change. Again, I did another video on connected speech in a lot more detail, so please go back and watch that if you want a bit more information on this. But instead of would you like a coffee, we'd say would you? Would you like a coffee? Okay. However, in a lot of these examples, we will not actually contract would. And that's because would has too much of an effect on the meaning. So remember that when a word changes the meaning, we normally make sure to emphasize it when we're speaking in English. And for example, here's some examples where that would not happen. My mum would make me a birthday cake every year, because that's expressing the idea of past habit, okay? Or the cook would have used this to make bread. I contract have, because this is an auxiliary and it's not important, but I don't contract would here because it's helping us know that past habit, that reoccurring habit. Or also, she wouldn't allow him to go out, okay? Remember, especially when it's a negative, we won't contract these kind of auxiliary verbs because they're affecting or changing the meaning. Okay, everyone, I really hope you enjoyed that. This is a topic I feel very passionately about in English, this idea of pragmatics. And now we sort of talked about it a little bit. I really hope that you start to notice how we're using that. So just open your mind. If you're watching a film or a TV show in English, think about, oh, why are they using that structure? What are they expressing with it? When we are teaching, we always make sure to put this at the center of our language courses, because I really feel it's the most important way to learn to use language naturally and fluently. So do get in touch if you'd like to learn more about pragmatics, and until then, I will see you guys next time.